a flow through it that would work as a presentation. And so I ended up with 85 slides here. And I hope you're not going to be overwhelmed, and I hope you're not going to be confused. Or actually, I hope you are able to extract from my confusion something meaningful so that I get to understand the stuff better. So, let's see. Okay, I've got to make this smaller so I get my record button. No, that's not what I want. Oh. Record slideshow, that's what I want. Okay. So, okay, but it's not doing the proper image. Okay, I have to start again. I should have gone a little further with my testing. Escape. Sorry about that. Screen displays. I should have had mirror displays, shouldn't I? Okay. Let's see if it works. Oh, now I've got the wrong display on. I do need help because I've got my only instructions there.
You just mean you want it from the widescreen?
No, I want to have my presentation there and my presenter display here, and I had them both presenter display. So.
Okay, so.
But I don't have, I can't remember it here. Okay. So, start playing what happens. Try just play for now, first to see if it works. Yeah, now it works.
Okay.
So, now we want to go.
Yeah.
Now you want to do record.
Yeah.
Turn it off. Under play.
Yeah.
Record slideshow.
Or play recording.
Okay.
There we go.
I think so, as soon as I start. So it's good.
There it goes.
All right. This is something I do need to start with because I've worked with these two people for decades each, and they were definitely my strong mentors. But I don't want to say that these were the only people, because all of you, most that I have met so far, have been important to me. And there's such a community of good ideas and conversations, which is, after all, why I keep coming back, and I think a lot of you keep coming back. So thank you for that. So this topic, it's an interesting topic to come to because there's this sense that what is this? And there's some sort of heartfelt meaning to that, to it. So we think about the soul of resilience as, or resilience and soul. There are things that we think we understand, we hold them close to our hearts, and they take some kind of appearance that fades and comes and fades and comes, and we can't quite put our fingers on them, as many of the discussions have revealed, and many attempts in other communities to try and get them clear. So what exactly do they mean? Or, to put it the way I had it here, the title of the paper, what on earth do I mean by that? So, let's look at some of the notions, looking at what's available in the literature. And this seems to be a rather general notion about soul. It's an incorporeal essence of a living being, that which gives the body life, something that animates us. And therefore, it's kind of compared to something else, as we are inert except for the soul that animates us. And then a lot of religious traditions talk about the soul, but they speak of it generally as something eternal, And it seems to deal with our desire as humans to have something that continues past our own death. We don't seem to like to think about ourselves disappearing completely, whether it's in the works we leave behind or the soul that reincarnates or lives in some other place. And sort of an immortality sense. I personally don't have a great desire for immortality, but I know I encounter a lot of people who do. And on the other hand, there seems to be a sense of mystery about it. There's a sense of not being able to actually say what it is, that is kind of beyond our ken. Am I in your way?
No.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
To talk about something as nebulous or as unspecifiable, intangible, you can't actually put your finger on it, as what the soul might be. There's maybe better dealt with in poetry. Mary Oliver is one of my favorite poets, and she said, what the soul is also, I believe, I will never quite know. Though I play at the edges of knowing, truly I know our part is not knowing, but looking and touching and loving, which is the way I walk down softly through the pale pink morning light. When I found this, it corresponded to a thought I had had myself, but I think there's something about the border on it. So there's this mystery here, mystery of what is this? And on the other hand, there's a desire for permanence. So there's a kind of a tension of ideas in the concept of soul. And I find that in the long run, it's the permanence that seems to come to the fore, and the mystery falls into the background in many of the conversations I listen to. People seem to have a desire for thingifying, for making it something tangible, holdable, and somehow maybe it's part of trying to get out of the confusion or complexity of the world. But anyway, there it seems to be the case. So when I was thinking about this notion, already at least a decade ago, I tried to address it in my own poem before I saw Mary Oliver's. Dreaming dawn. Dreaming dawn, I found my soul this morning. I found it in the flow of being. In the flow of being. I recognized that it was something to do with existence and flow, and there wasn't any way you could stop that flow. So the other ambiguous concept, and I will come back to soul again later, try to bring it in some sort of coherence with it. So the etymology is ciliare, jump back, so something jumps back. When you look at images on the internet, if you go and search for soul, resilience images, you end up having lots of things like flowers or trees surviving out of some situation. So, and then spoken of as courage against odds. Or you get to think of it, unexpected strength. And building team resilience seems to be about power, the power for your organization to be there somehow. And just the image itself made me think that what the undercurrent of that meaning was not just being able to respond in an adaptive way. And then I found also that it's cosmetic called resilience, where I think then the intention is enduring you. So all these have to do with persistence. The resilience has to do with persistence of something. So looking up the dictionary, it is springing back, rebounding, coming like that as an etymology. Compressed and stretched and coming back again. And then there's the more commonly used meaning, that in the recovering for adversity and so on. And in Wikipedia, you find that there is actually one of these words that was first technically defined and then moved into various lineages of conversation and took on new meanings, because the technical definition was very specific. It was meant to just talk about how energy is stored and released in mechanical things. And for us, it's not a matter, when we are resilient, it's not a matter of building up a store of energy and then being able to release it at some point when we respond in a resilient way or an ecosystem responds. It's not about that. But words do that. They move into other conversations and take on meanings currently. So looking at ecosystem resilience, I've worked with Buzz Halding and the Resilience Alliance for a couple of decades, maybe longer now. But that was all mostly in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. Resilience was considered in ecology as the rate in which a system returns to stability following a perturbation. Now, if you start to think about that, there's a lot of ambiguities in that apparently clear statement. First of all, rate. How fast? How fast does it have to return? What is it supposed to return in a year, a decade, a millennium? Ecosystems are slow in many cases. So why do we want to look at a specific time that we impose as the appropriate one? And what is stability? Ecosystems go through annual cycles, they go through all kinds of other cycles of growth and replacement. They go through evolutions where there's fire. What is that stability that we're talking to? And what's a perturbation? Is a windstorm a perturbation? How big a storm does it have to be before you consider it just a course of normal things that the ecosystem is adapted to? Is a fire a perturbation or part of the normal cycle of that forest? So it's again what we consider to be out of our normal experience. So we speak of it as perturbation. And then system. How do you find the boundary of systems that aren't design systems or living systems, which tend to have a relatively discernible boundary? Where is the edge of a lake? Or more difficulty, where is the edge of the desert? It seems to grade into other systems rather than having a reasonable short ecocline. So all of this assumes that the remaining elements conserve those relations that are important for the development of a system that we can recognize as a similar or same system as before. So many ambiguities in there. The recovery time, perturbation, and then how much change is acceptable for us to consider it the same or not the same. So the adaptive cycle. And this was Halding's work that from way back when, really in the 70s, it started to develop, where you have a system growing, first of all, logistically, at the rate R, the R phase, in that early growth phase, and then coming to a climax, which instead of being represented with a C, got represented with a K. And Halding's recognition was that there are further stages. That climax falls down into an omega phase, and then there's a phase of reorganization that we ended up calling the alpha. So the adaptive cycle had a way of going around and round in a loop. Now, the vertical dimension I haven't labeled here. It was capital. That there was an increase of capital as you came to the K phase. They lost it all in omega. Then there was a slow build-up adequate for the innovative aspects of the system for making connections. And then some of that capital got used up in making the connections such that the system could grow again. Such was the thinking in this for many decades. I've thought a little further about it, and I recognize that we can look at this system as two phases. This is the phase that is the domain of the system as we know it. The rest is not really the system yet. The background is the domain of elements out of which the system might be composed. And here's where Halding must have had a similar idea, because you see that little tail there, where it goes off? It could go off from those same elements and not become a repeat of this cycle, but go off and become a different cycle. And the infinity image, I think, is, again, ethically or aesthetically pleasing, as is his name of choice for the whole word, which was panarchy, because Buzz was a kind of mischievous person, and he liked to refer to the Greek god Pan, as well as the Pan as meaning everywhere.
What does panarchy mean?
Pan is, instead of a hierarchy, panarchy is a rule distributed throughout the system. So there's no
What throughout system?
throughout rule, control, influence, whatever. Use the word rule. So, but rule in our way of thinking would have to be something we had written down and become specific. But ecosystems don't write rules. So, taking this further, if we take this capital and connectedness figure, put it in the box so I can show you what I'm doing. I'm going to turn it around. The constituted system and the component systems are in the two faces, as I just showed you. But being in a box, I can start rotating the box. And I'll rotate it so we're going to have a look at it from above. And you find that the same loop actually is a circle. Depends on how you look at it. And what we were thinking of as connectedness can be broken down into two different axes. We can think of it as systems connections and interscale links. So the system is internally connected as well as connected to its outside world, which it must be in order to survive. You can't have an isolated system without a flow of energy and adaptability, essentially, with the outside. So in this, there is also ability to look at the poverty trap. And the situation where the elements do not have enough energy to reconnect, that you get back into chaos. And I think this is where we could clearly say that system is not resilient on the time scale that we would like to consider useful. And there's the rigidity trap, where the connections internally become so rigid that the system becomes unable to adapt to its circumstances, which means it becomes very vulnerable to a change in its context, such that the rigid structure that is there can no longer respond. The system cannot connect. And those are the original alpha and omega, alpha, R, K, and omega as it goes around. And there at alpha is where we talk about the capacity to self-organize. And that became a lot of the conversations within the Resilience Alliance, where one of the better descriptions of ecosystem resilience was the capacity of an ecosystem to tolerate disturbance without collapsing into a qualitatively different state that is controlled by different sets of processes. Qualitatively. See, even with science that's meant to be a basic science, you end up having to talk of qualitative issues because a lot of the stuff that really matters to us, we really can't pinpoint fully.
Billy, will you take a question?
Of course.
That
You want me to
assumes-
go back?
Yeah, maybe one. That is, the concern about it not restoring is sort of an assumption that you want to keep what you've had, but if you're doing economic development, you're trying to get away from what you've got towards something you think is better.
Mm-hmm.
So is that resilient?
I don't think that's considered resilience unless what you're thinking about is changing the resilience of the system from, let's say, back in the poverty trap, that is economic development, you may be wondering, you bring it out of the poverty trap so it can self-organize. But usually we don't let it self-organize. We impose hierarchically a power structure kind of on it. This is the organization we want. And that's where Maturana's little concept that whenever you want change in a system, you should consider what you wish to conserve and let the other elements fit in as they will, rather than trying to structure the whole, because you never understand all the connections anyway.
Doesn't recursion rule out the possibility of returning to whatever you have?
I beg your pardon?
Doesn't the concept of recursion in living systems, including the Eco-7 system, negate the idea that you can ever return to what you have?
It would, and I don't hear that being spoken of. Because even if you are doing a very cyclic kind of system, that the fire managed system, for example, where some areas in pine burn down, grow up in the same pine, it's not going to be exactly the same next time around. So, but it's accepted as, oh yeah, it's the same, because it's within the bounds of the description.
But negate, I think, is too strong.
Yeah.
It doesn't negate. It's not the negative of.
It's just not
mutually exclusive.
considered. It's not considered. It's not made explicit. Yes, Tom.
Mary Catherine Bateson had this phrase of us being our own metaphor.
Yes.
And I think our own physical self-experience has a strong impact on how we experience that relationship between what was and what seems to come again. Because when you cut your finger, it comes back and it seems to be in the state that it was in before. So I think, especially in healthy organisms, healing and recovering has a physical, like the perception of it is that of returning to where we were, even though it doesn't, but it seems to feel like it. And then there are all the social constructs about determinability and repeatability in mechanisms and in science that reinforce that. But I think our experience of our bodies, especially young and healthy bodies,
I was going to say, you're not old enough.
They give an impression of things returning to where they were.
I think that's the importance of pointing at concepts such as cybernetic concepts that I've come to know and see as part of generating something, generating newness, if you will. It's, and I do mean negate, not in the sense of violate, but it rules out that possibility.
I don't think in this discourse it rules out the possibility. It's simply an assumption that, of course, that happens, but it's not relevant.
Well, we can have this conversation.
Okay.
I don't want to.
I'm not referring to myself now, but as much as I understand my colleagues in ecology. So I shouldn't really be speaking for absent peoples, but.
I know you can.
So I also think of this as there's a difference between the generative domain, how things are made, and then the phenomenon that emerges. There's a kind of result and process thing. If I think about ecosystem processes and resilience, the processes are part of the generative domain, and resilience is a phenomenon that we see. It's a phenomenon that we attribute to systems under conditions that we are indeed ambiguous, but have a kind of quality to them that most people find that it goes back to the heart. We feel this quality, but we get into different qualities because we can't specify it for any particular circumstance. Or maybe for some circumstance we can. So there's this balance here too of persistence and adaptation. These two orthogonal ideas are trying to, non-commensurate ideas, both have to be in kind of an interplay. Maybe balance is the wrong word, an interplay between the two. And this reminds me very much of what we talked about in Soul, that the interplay of mystery. Sorry, I wanted to keep this on for a sec. Mystery and permanence, so adaptation and persistence. So persistence and permanence are also things I want to look at a little more. And you can see why I got myself tangled in thinking about this. Persistence and permanence of what? What is it that's being persisted? What is the it that we want to persist or remain permanent? So looking at that, on what basis do we distinguish that system that persists through various cycles of change? What basis do we could distinguish it? And sometimes we think of those systems that have a tendency to be very resilient, like this ivy. But we're not really interested in that one. We don't want the ivy to become. It's become an invasive species, or it's become a weed species. That dandelion, which you use as your, many people consider it a weed, but it's a very resilient, adaptable species. Judy?
Yeah, I must say this, that this ivy thing is a really interesting paradox, because in the bee world, honeybee world, what we find, at least in Maryland, is that one of the most resourceful food sources in the fall. So everybody's been, cut the ivy off your trees because it kills the trees. But what we find is that the ivy that grows up the trees produces the seed that is can often correlates to whether or not those bees make it through this winter, because it is an incredible food source.
Mm-hmm.
So the dilemma is now, how do we have trees but also keep the ivy?
Well, ivy in the forest is natural in the UK. This is an invasive species in the sense that it was brought by us,
Right.
and does more in this country and
so were the
this
bees.
continent. And so there it's come into some kind of tolerable balance. We need to give it time if it's going to come into tolerable balance, but then we're not able to control what that system is going to look like. And there's a lot of human desire involved in this.
Well, that's really important, because I'm interested in the resilience of honeybees.
Mm-hmm. That's your desire.
Well, it's not quite a desire, but we
Yeah. But in a sense, that's what we decide to tend to, what is relevant to us. So what we consider relevant, while so many other things change. So resilience has to do with something about that, or some relationship we consider relevant. My son, he's young, my son, somewhat older, and there's been a lot of change. But and there's change in the relationship, but there's something that has remained consistent and is not denied. So there remains this balance, and it depends on the observer. It depends on the person who considers, or that group, socially agreeing people who consider something to be relevant. So it could be the forest, an agricultural landscape, an urban landscape, or a cityscape. And people may have different attachments, and therefore different interests in these. And they pay more or less attention to one or the other. So, another sidestep. I'm going to come back to my touchstone notion, this image that Maturana often uses. Some people here not familiar with it, possibly. It's just the little arrow going around is the living system composing itself through autopoiesis. The two arrows up and down are its connection to its medium, and the little arc below is its medium. This is a figure that he developed in the 60s, I think. And
Have you ever left it open? I've never seen him leave it open.
It's not open.
It is open.
Yeah. I've seen him leave it open.
I've never seen that.
And there, in fact, I think some published versions of it are open
Well,
too.
interpretations are another thing.
It's not open.
So, if I look at it, the system is acting in the behavioral domain. The medium changes, whatever that medium is, whether it's the physical world, biological world, or the social world, any aspect of the world. So in the economic, environmental, and social domain, to make it up, there's a response of some kind. It may be minimal, it may be large. And then that living system senses it, and through that sensory effector coordination in this cognitive domain that we don't see easily, we can only infer, something is happening. And I'd like currently to use the word cohering rather than the longer phrase sensory effector coordination. And all of this is happening in the dynamic environment, the dynamic flow of exchanges. Living system happens a kind of continuity of that. I want to look a little more closely at similar parts within the living system as well. And this is abstract. So I'm going to look at the language and rational thinking. That which we usually, most people when you talk about thinking, that's what they refer to. They refer to thinking as the thoughts they have, that explicit thoughts that they can distinguish. But that's not our whole cognitive system. We have a lot more going on. So I add systemic thinking, that which is happening and leads us to have the insights that seem to come from nowhere because they weren't worked out logically in language. But this system and that system are also in recursion. One acts, the other responds, and it's sensed, and so, but it's circular. In a circular system, there is no cause and effect, of course. It's constantly circular. And then this is also, the systemic thinking is acting on the rest of the bodyhood, which with all the other systems that have to do also with how we're able to relate the immune systems, the hormonal systems and all of that, which are also influencing our thinking. So there's this constant complication of recursion there. Oops, wrong button. So I'm going to put this into a little bit better scale and see that going around, and it's in a context of a lot of other systems doing the same. And each of them having to come into some form of co-resonance in spite of whatever differences there may be amongst them. So as a social system, they are all interacting. I should have them interacting with each other, but I left out the arrows because it just got too busy. But there is a lot of other arrows I could add of all the other things that we are not directly responding to each other. So we end up being in a broadly complex world. And this is where we can think of ourselves not only in a fluid dynamic, but in this fluid dynamic, in a relational embeddedness, always in a relational embeddedness, with all these multiple relations, which, if Michael's right that we can only think of 3 to 5 things at once, then we obviously are not considering all of them at once. A couple of years ago, I did a paper on dancing with ambiguity, and this is one that I'm pulling parts from other presentations forward. And I was talking about cognition having kind of a broad spectrum and being kind of not very explicit. And other than that, language is a narrower spectrum, but it allows further behavior in another dimension, and it becomes more explicit. Then culture can further narrow this to bring us into an even narrower possibility of language, as each language does. And this is then in recursion with the language and the cognition in a constant sense. This is a more abstract way of saying that. So, quoting David here, our ethical duty is to become reflexively aware of our relational embeddedness. What this means is I haven't discussed reflection yet, but I will come to that. But that seems to imply that we're considering all of these forms of awareness. But language in particular. Language has this funny relationship with a culture, or not so funny. It influences what people see and how they act. How they act determines the kind of world that arises. The kind of world that arises then validates the language because it fits with it, and then that language remains accepted in the culture. So language kind of chunks experience according to how that culture has started chunking that experience, and those chunks tend to become somewhat rigid. I've used this metaphor before too, and I'll just enlarge on it a bit. That as we evolved. Our heritage has been that broad systemic cognition, which has always included our ability to be mobile creatures, to navigate in the landscape, that it's an experience, it's a coherent, connected, makes sense to the living being, and yet diverse whole. So we can move through this landscape and develop through our very movement the sense of the whole, even though we're not moving through the whole, we can sense more of it, and as we meander or explore, more and more becomes visible to us, especially as we act on it and our actions influence. Well, walking is itself an action. It influences my perspective on where I am. So it's one of the simplest kinds of cognitive recursions. So we compose the dimensionality for living in it. And then to coordinate with others, we parse, and I like the word chunk our experience. There's that tree on the hillside where you can go and gather nuts. There's that little valley where you can find a stream. There's a little place where you really can't cross. And that hillside is too steep. So we'll give them names: hillside, tree, stream, and so on. And we name the relevant parts. The name chunks become the things, the name, the language. We know in our experience that they're not everything, but they become modes of navigating that landscape. They evoke the rest of it, especially if you know the landscape. Especially and then if we know a similar landscape, we can take that notion that there are betweens, there are things that lie between the name chunks that make sense of it as a whole, because that's in our embodied experience. But if we haven't, and we study these as if they were things in themselves, the abstract only, then they become our cultural reality. Reality encodes that we start believing that this is the world. And there are some things that I think we do this with. Another example, a couple of friends cooking, baking together in the kitchen. They participate, and as their participation, they have a unified whole of their experience. And as they talk about it, they parse and chunk their behavior while they're stirring, chopping, melting, kneading, baking. So these are the units of making cookies, for example. And these, if they're just left as names, don't have a lot of the betweens in them. Luke Huffman pointed out to me once that even go get some eggs from the fridge has a lot of implicits in it, that then, or what I'm starting to call the betweens, because go and fridge have a whole array of steps between them. So with the name procedures, without this, are just pieces. They're missing a lot. And if anybody's ever tried to cook a recipe without having ever seen how some of the parts are done, you realize it's very much more useful to either experiment yourself or watch someone do it. Why are the cooking shows so important? So we create these procedures, and we think the procedures are adequate for conveying the thing, but the betweens go missing unless they are included through experience. If they are, then the chunks become the navigational touchstones that enable us to go through. I have an example here. A simple sentence. 2 children were playing on the beach. The girl dragged the boy along the sand. They got up and ran away. What's the image in your mind? There's a lot that's happening there that just is not conveyed in the simple sentences. So back to resilience after that little side trip. As applied to ecosystems or to integrated systems of people and the natural environment, because that's what the Resilience Alliance tended to think of, not just humans, not just ecosystems, but us as part of and integrated with ecosystems. But defining characteristics, we do want to define. Maybe it's to be able to talk. It's the amount of change, as we talked about, the degree to which the system is capable of self-organization, in other words, the recovery part of that alpha, to be able to come back and be something, and the ability to build and increase the capacity for learning and adaptation. And that then goes to your question about, somebody's question about the economic system. We want to be able to build, increase the capacity, but that's a desire we add on to presumably to increase the resilience, or the ability to increase resilience may be part of resilience. So kind of recursion, second order recursion. But if I go through this, I'll be able to come to a lot of ambiguous terms. Each of them I could go start exploring in greater detail, because what do they mean? Our language evokes an idea, but it doesn't actually pinpoint it. Because language is not a representation of the world. So, ambiguities.
In my experience.
Mhm.
It's a representation of my experience of the world.
And only then an evocation that corresponds to your experience, but doesn't fully represent it.
Never can.
Yeah.
My biology prevents it.
And your biology enables you to act anyway. So chunks or names are always simplifications. Yet we gain something from them. As we gain experience in any landscape, and I don't mean just physical, I mean conceptual or disciplinary landscape, we learn to attend to some complex regularities, things that have recognizable, recurrent shapes, or shapes that we can feel ourselves relating to. Much of the chairs here are recognizable as chairs, even though most chairs don't look like these ones. And we refer to these name notions that enable us to coordinate our activities. And so Carpenter box definition probably is the one I find most closer to my ecosystem understanding, is a broad, multifaceted, and loosely organized cluster of concepts. Each one relates to some aspect of the interplay of transformation and persistence. There we go. The two words again. This tension between what is to be and what can change. And I guess that's undercurrent of all learning. There's always an interplay of conservation and change, transformation and persistence. So these two words again, transformation and persistence, or permanence and mystery, is talked about in Soul. I was in an interesting situation this spring where I had an opportunity to speak to a number of musicians. And I asked them, what is the soul of music? We were having a dinner conversation after their performance. And then I realized, that's not a good question. Is a bad thing. So no, let's take this differently. How do you sense the soul of music? What do you look to when you're talking about it? And I started getting answers. It said there was something to do with the rapport with the audience. There was something to do with the rapport with the music itself. And then the conversation got animated. We started getting lots and lots of different ideas coming forth that all have to do with the soul of music. And this discussion about does that matter? Yes, ended up being kind of agreement, yes, they all matter. So I spoke back to them and said, well, what if we consider that the soul of music arises as an experience of harmony or congruence in multiple dimensions of flow, which are all relevant to the situation. Experience of harmony or congruence, something that, yes, these are fitting together appropriately. My experience, for example, as the being with the music, being with the audience, the sound of the music, the accuracy of the notes, all of it as a coherent whole. And then course, that soul will have different qualities depending on particular context, particular music, and so on. And so they were all relevant to the whole. And as they are relevant to the whole, realize that you can't explicitly attend to all of them at once. It's just not possible to actually, while you're in the midst of playing a piece in the concert, you can't be explicitly, I'm in this, and this. But that doesn't really matter, because they all pertain to the whole. So if you act in the harmony of this sense, then that's the thing you need to attend to, is kind of in an aesthetic sense rather than anything else, that these things are fitting together and acting on whatever aspect you sense is not. And that brings back this image I had earlier that is happening in systemic cognition, language, and culture, all of them simultaneously, in that kind of sense that where they feel coherent, experienced as coherent. So they take this phrase back to resilience. Could I ask whether the soul of resilience arises as an experience of harmony or congruence in multiple dimensions of dynamic flow? All dimensions are relevant to the whole. Which dimensions are we going to attend to? What's relevant to us? What do we consider to be those dimensions that are relevant to the tending to the resilience? But we can't attend to all of them. Having been a simulation modeler for a couple of decades, I realized that we never could build these simulation models to refer to everything, and besides, they trunked even more badly than language does, because you have to be very explicit numerically. But so we can't necessarily attend to them all. It's not possible. So what do we want to attend to? And this is where we really are somewhat in the dark. What is it that really matters to us? I think I have to go back to much more general view, to think of myself or any person as seeing the whole as being part of themselves, being part of me, that I am not isolated from the whole is part of me, and my regard of the whole is through all the sensing that I can possibly bring to bear, my cognitive language, a systemic understanding, my experience. And then this ends up as an experience of the harmony and the flow of the whole. And it can be expanded to any situation. The leaf is a small dimension, a small extent. It can go into a larger extent. And all dimensions are important to the quality of the whole, but we can't attend to them all. And if we want to regard ourselves and our planet, what we really have to consider is that we're not excluding any dimensions intentionally or through the hubris of thinking we have them all. So that's where I start thinking about the soul of resilience is ethical. It's avoiding that hubris and making sure that we do attend to everything that we conceivably can. So ethical, another ambiguous term, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but because we're in this society, I'll bring in Heinz von Förster and his ethical imperative: act always to increase the number of choices. How do we know what the choices are? Are there even choices outside of having this created chunks in language that we name choices, that we can then look between one and another and evaluate them? What about, is that musician making choices all along, or is he or she acting just in the congruence of that dynamic cycle of being engaged? So that must be something else, and I think that you can't see because of the shadow. I've got this. Care for the other is assumed. I think that is assumed in the way Heinz said this. The choices are regarding the choices of the other. So there's assumption that you care what happens to the other. And the other may be a human being who could make choices by explicitly saying, I can do this or that. It could be a dog who doesn't know what its choices are but moves in one way or another. It could be the ecosystem. It could be our financial system, where the choices being made at individual levels are not necessarily the choices made in designing the system. And our personal ethics are the sum of the processes we evoke while making choices. This is Michael Lissack's present way of saying he's gone, so he can't defend himself. So again, we have this word choices. But sure, choices do happen in language. And the sum of the processes, maybe he's referring to all the cognition. And then evocation, I think, always has to be culturally specific. So I think he's, in a sense, implicating, though he may not agree. For me, in reading that phrase, I can see those implications in there. And maybe this should be conversation, not culture. There's enough people in here who have convinced me that conversation is culture, the network of conversations, and that's how cultures evolve. Is this wisdom? Could it be? If we act and care, considering the sum of the processes while we make choices? And then going back to Chandler's ethical duty of reflexively aware of our relational embeddedness, I want to come back to this picture of the distinctions in the culture. Because what we hadn't covered yet is this reflexive part. And reflection is the stepping back and seeing something from the perspective of having stepped back from it. Not necessarily evaluating it, but seeing it. And in that reflectively awareness, you can look at something, aha, the distinctions accepting the culture is doing this and making these changes. I'm not going to allow that validation to happen. I'm going to choose which distinctions indeed I accept. So that reflective awareness of our relational embeddedness, for me, includes being careful about what distinctions in the culture I am willing to accept and go with. And this is, I know, is an undercurrent amongst many of my colleagues here, that you want to reconsider. And that duty thing, too. I spoke to David earlier about this. Maybe duty is a word that people will be activated by, want to rebel against, because duty is usually imposed from the outside. There might be a better word there.
That's a moral
Yes.
versus from a Heinz perspective.
Yes, not rather than ethical.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm coming close to the end here. All these rather ambiguous concepts, soul, resilience, ethical, all in a complex network where we ourselves arise as being elements, parts, and active within the network. And I'll add some more network on top to be sure that we see we're embedded in it, not just looking at it. So I would call this a caring, systemic view of a systemic existence. And then back to more specifically to resilience, and all these notions, they are grounded in our experience with all our relations in the first person sense, not just our relatives, but all the relations that we have with everything in our experience, our living. Notions that enable us to socially, individually orient in the balance of integrity and openness. Balance of persistence and change. For myself, I prefer to change those to integrity and openness to change. What do I conserve integrity and what am I willing to change? and my ideas are the easiest parts to change. And my body, I suppose. So to act resilient, I think we must be resilient. So how do we teach our children, in our education system, how does resilience come to be something that's relevant to people as something other than a medical or sort of a heroic thing to do, but it's a normal thing to just live in the resilience. And there's also hubris, I find, in being responsible. So being responsible without the hubris of, I am responsible for it. There's a nuance of difference. I hope you can sense it. Yeah. And then bring us back, for me back anyway, to fundamental assumption or fundamental reflexive choice. In other words, you assume it or you think about it. What kind of beings do we humans want to be? What kind of beings do we want to be in this birth? And then I have to bring myself in. I have been speaking from myself, and this is a matter of my ideas, and as Larry Richards would always say, everything that we say is an idea, including the idea that I'm saying this. So I have to be somewhat responsible, or I feel responsible for all that I've been saying, and that's the way it is. And I wish to remain reflexively aware of embeddedness and avoid the solipsism of anything goes just because it's me doing it. No, if you're responsible, you cannot just become solipsistic because you're doing this in the care of the other. So in that care and resilience, I can avoid cynicism, despair, and hubris as well as I can. And for me, I realized this diagonal allows me to talk about it as a kind of an aesthetic of ethics. There's a sense of beauty, of well-being, of brightness in being ethical that isn't a duty. It's some soul response for me as I sense my manner of living. And doesn't mean that I'm always capable, by no means. I am known to have outbursts of anger too. Not very often, but I can. So what do we choose to believe? What do we choose to believe about ourselves as humans to enable the appropriate action towards the sense of who we are? Appropriate action, what is the belief we have? And we talked about this in the group, that it's how we act that matters. Not how we believe, but how do our beliefs determine our actions. The way we behave and be in the world is the way of judging the beliefs. But I've long talked about liking to go with the fundamental belief that we are not only Homo sapiens, we are Homo sapiens amans, the loving human being. Or perhaps, in a reflexive manner, we are Homo sapiens sapiens amans, so reflexively loving. Or maybe it should be Homo amans sapiens amans, I don't know. However, to think of other beings as having that in the core of their humanness, I find it makes relationships with others easier than assuming they're wicked or evil. Of course, people do evil things. And maybe some of them are so trapped in that there's no way a discourse will help. But yet, in my daily life, this is easier. So I would say the soul of resilience arises through distinguishing ourselves as the kind of being engages in an ethically oriented, reflexive awareness of our dynamic flow in a relational embeddedness. So in that sense, the soul of resilience, for me, is ethical. And thank you. Oh my goodness, I took almost an hour. Sorry. I think we're going to go on to this the workshop experience shortly. Do you want to have questions now, or this is, we have the rest of the week
Now,
for further.
yes.
What?
We should have those questions and answers or responses now if we're gonna have them.
Okay. Michael isn't here to say otherwise, so let's start.
Disagreement? Yes, we have agreement.
We don't have disagreement.
No, we don't.
Yes.
How or where do we draw the boundaries of resilience of the system?
That's a good question. I think it depends on the context, the circumstance, and your awareness, our awareness. And that is, again, where a group discussion can expand awareness of what's relevant. Because what's a system?
It might arise out of conversation or negotiation.
I would think so. And then in that conversation and negotiation, I would hope that people would realize that they are making these as choices of what to include and not to include. In other words, become responsible for the system they are feeling they're dealing with. And when we get into the problem of externalities, what are we externalizing?
First of all, thank you. This was, again, very beautiful. This is just a very, very tiny, sorry?
Speak up, please.
A very tiny comment to one aspect regarding your discussion of ethics and the phrase that we use of making choices.
Yes.
And the underlying thinking, of course, is very agreeable to me. There is a problem with language in our group, I think, that starts with talking about, for example, variety of message and variety of channel as if it was the same, the actual and the potential. And I think there is an ambiguity in the term making choices, because making choices can be interpreted as a variety reducing selection, and it can also be interpreted as a creative amplification of variety. A chef who invents a new menu and puts it on a new dish and puts it on the menu is creating a new option, and out of those options a choice can be made. And we refer to both of these activities as making choices. And I think the ethical version of that Heinz is referring to is the variety amplifying one.
Mm-hmm.
So this is just something that I have realized recently. So I'm now trying to use the words creating choices and making selections, or something like that, to be clear about that.
But then in the Resilience Alliance, the last thing was having a system develop the capacity to adapt and learn is in that direction of creating making possible more choices without actually specifying them. So you can create, as you said, a specific choice, but there could also be the ability for the system to create alternatives.
So there are multiple interpretations,
yes.
And I'm still not clear whether that ambiguity is good to have and to leave, or to introduce, or to try and be more precise about it.
I don't know.
It's not a question. It's just.
Yeah. And to me, it would be nice if we could be clear about which form we do allude to when we speak, but that requires not only a definition of it, but a way of simplifying. When you have simple words, you need to have the tendrils that work back down to the larger meaning that you have, and it's sometimes not possible without building it up. Yes, Judy?
Well, thanks for provoking and triggering own ideas about Macarona for me. I really get that from you whenever I hear you, and I don't get that in many other places. And when I think of Saul and Macarona, I think of the psychic space, the third phenomenal domain that he talks about. The first being the organizational closer, the second being the relational space, the third being the psyche space that all that entails. And that's that. I hadn't put that together until you presented your presentation. So I hear him saying, not him saying, but I hear him saying that the circle is the bodyhood. The medium with the circle is the relational space's mind. And then all that it entails, which we see and do not see and never can know completely, is the psychic space, the soul. So body, mind, soul.
Oh, okay.
And I found that a really useful.
That's an interesting way to see it. Yeah, I'm going to play with that. Thank you. Yes.
Pille, thanks, I enjoyed it. I wanted to ask you, I've also been thinking of the word care a lot in terms of ethics. How would you define it, or how do you define it as apart from love?
Love does not necessarily come with care because it's simply an acceptance of the other, which doesn't mean that you have to act in any way towards that other. I can love something that I'm not going to interact with at all. And that to care means that I am willing to interact with it to increase its ability to be. So love is let it be, and care for me is increase its ability to be. So
I think I hear your ideas around love as at this point in the present as a desire, as a false statement, if you will. Because I think after 100 years of living culturally in a society that provokes and perpetuates and generates the idea that aggression is a fundamental way of being, has negated that love, and my desire would be, how can we bring that back to being, which you do by verbalizing it as the case.
yeah, it's interesting what the premise we use as our fundamental way of being, how that alters our fundamental actions in the world.
Right.
Yes.
Or generate them.
Just to comment on love, I guess my perception would be there's layers of different definitions that range from the one that you used, which is really about how you feel about someone as opposed to how you react. But I think there are definitions of love that would require action. If you love someone, action would be a necessary part of it. So just a variety of definitions. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a longer conversation. Yeah.
I'm trying to reconcile or translate your definition of resilience into a more technical biological framework. To me, what I'm hearing, you can comment on this, is there's a concept of homeostasis, and that is something that is acting on a lot of different scales in biology, from the smallest organism up to the largest living organization. And so you can keep the definition of resilience as homeostasis if you're very specific about what scale in the biological spectrum you're talking about. Does that make sense?
So if you went to the homeostasis of the heart, then how would you speak about resilience of the heart if homeostasis meant it kept doing the same thing? It too needs to adapt to activity for so on.
Well, to me, the heart is not a biological entity. It is biological, but it's not. It's not a cell. It's
an organ.
It's an organ, right?
Okay.
So
Let's use a cell then.
Okay. How is a cell keeping resilient? It's taking in order into itself and that it needs. and it is discarding disorder, entropy, that is interfering with its ability to maintain itself and its environment. And that basic mechanism happens on all scales in biology.
I would contend that the cell is unable to specify entropy. It would be taking in materials.
Well, the biologists came up with an alternative word for order, dysentropy.
Did you say entropy?
Entropy.
Yes?
Yes. Entropy is the order that they need.
But that's negative entropy, isn't it?
Negative entropy is order.
Yes. Yeah.
And how you define what order is in terms of what that particular cell needs.
And always the needs is with respect to what else happening if it doesn't have it. So again, we've entered into this as having to specify what it is we think we don't want to happen. And so what you're saying is that you want the homeostasis to be conserved, and that you will call resilience the ability to conserve that.
Yeah. I'm thinking, I guess, on a more fundamental level, that all living beings seek to live and to live well, to survive and thrive. And there are certain things that they need to do that. And we can think of that as dysentropy or order.
Okay.
Roger Penrose gives a wonderful talk in which he says for example, what biology needs is not energy, but it is dysentropy. It is energy that is focused at a particular point. You can think of this as heat engines.
Well, I think you and I are going to have a dinner together or something, because what we need to talk about is autopoiesis. But David's been waving his glasses at me.
I just had a question I wasn't sure about. If resilience was the experience of harmony and congruence in the flow of life, which makes a lot of sense, how is it that in order to enhance that we would need to focus upon what was important to us? Or how is it that we would need care to enable things to be better rather than love and acceptance? Because it seems to me that the more we're thinking about making those cuts and separations, thinking about how what exists is problematic and negative and we should be changing it, we're sort of moving away from that experience of ourselves in harmony and congruence. In fact, we're destabilizing and making that impossible. So how do these things fit?
Well, let's jump back into, I'm not negating love. I consider care to be a form of love. It's not as if without love, care would turn into dominance, because you wouldn't be accepting the other as that other, and you would be trying to impose on them your version of what you think they should be. And so it has to happen within the orientation or emotion of love, of acceptance. But we're still stuck in being clear to what exactly, this is the ethical dilemma, what extent, if I care for you now, is that going to do something to the rest of the room? Other people may be wanting to talk and ask questions, and am I going to, if I just had a one-on-one conversation? So, yeah.
Albert Schweitzer addressed that. He said that all that is ethical goes back to a single principle, reverence for life. Becoming ever more.
Well, yes.
Yes.
I'd like to respond to that
Please.
statement, and this is just one response, no more, no less.
I got it.
I mean, it's not,
Judy,
this is
I
a
trust you.
formula for, right. We need dialogical participation. we need to recognize the circularity of needs, and we need to retard the decay.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you. Yeah, each of those statements needs to be unpacked. Paul then
We'll do that tomorrow.
Yeah.
Like Tom Fisher, I wanted to thank you for the beauty of the presentation, both visually and also conceptually, or to the soul, if I might say that. You touched on many things. The thing I would like to hear more about, not necessarily now, but I think is a path to be continued, is this relationship of resilience to the ability to self-organize. But then what is the it?
Yes.
And what is possible to become? I didn't hear the word, maybe I missed it, autopoiesis or evolution, but somehow they feel like they come into this as well. As Jutso kindly pointed out, recursion means change, but what is changing and what is allowed to change, I think, is a beautiful question. In the ecological environment, it does seem like we wanted to go back to what kind of pretty much we had, in the same way that for Tom's metaphor, when you cut a finger, you don't want something else to come back. You want the finger back. But this allowance of evolution towards something, can I use the word greater or different, certainly, perhaps even more, is, I think, a wonderful exploration that I think I would love to hear more
Yes,
about,
yes.
perhaps another time. I also like the way you expose the emergence of your ideas and the telling of the story of your ideas, which I appreciate very much.
Oh, it was even more chaotic than it happening than it appears here.
It was order.
Close.
Well, as usual, I have to congratulate you for
Oh my
the
goodness,
presentation.
stop.
It is, it's just always amazing, and that in itself is a pleasure to hear. There's one thing that I am, from an epistemological point of view, a little bit worried about, and actually I was pleased when you, in the end, said something about love, and it had something to do with respecting others. Now, that I would like to contrast. Many of the things that you said had to do with awareness. How do I know that anyone is aware? We know maybe ourselves that we think about, we can envision certain things, but I think that is something which should be, well, let's say, operationalized, like in the case of love. You mentioned the issue of just thinking about it as opposed to actions, and I think love must be, in some sense, manifest in what you do with other people. Now, let me just take one statement, the increase of choices. Now, what is a choice?
Yeah.
Can you observe it? No. Huh? Yes, you can write down here what you see, and then you can, this is a very rational type of thing, but in fact, it is not, in practice, it isn't done that way. You act. And for example, the choice of love or not love, this is a question of manifestations. So I wonder if this emphasis on an awareness, which is kind of very satisfying personally, but it isn't really helping very much to understand how it's enacted. And that's the reason why I think what I'm missing is, in a way, the communication aspect of many of the things that you say. How can you communicate the increase of choices? And I have been often objecting to Heinz von Förster's statement, increase of choices. You can increase of choices for yourself. You can increase of choices by having more weapons or whatever. You can do that all, but the issue, that is not really the issue. And you pointed out, in fact, in a kind of a side comment, that it had to do with others. And to me, that is important. To me, I think, again, an increase of choices would be increase of choices of others to respond to what you say and allow other people to be respected for what they say. That is an increase of choices, but it is relational. It is not an abstract.
It's relational too, right?
Really?
So it's not just how you yourself act, but it is as how the relationship flows. So this is why I've been trying to bring in all those flowing images. Rather than choice, I think the word is whim. Because we act just
What was
because
that word?
whim.
Whim.
And then, not whimsy, but we act with a sense of this is the right thing to do. And sometimes it turns out to be wrong, and sometimes it turns out to have consequences. But that's where the relationship, I respond as oh no, that wasn't the right thing. I got to backtrack as I see you nodding or not nodding.
Yeah, but I think the point with the choice is to give the choices to others, not to actually.
Yes, I agree. I fully agree. It's
Klaus
not
and I have
about.
had this disagreement before. I feel that the relational component is implicit in Heinz's comment. Heinz, who said A is better off and B is better off, I think it's implicit. And in discussions with Heinz, it was clear that he meant it relationally. The statement alone doesn't emphasize that, but I believe it's implied.
You and then Klaus.
Just bearing in mind
No, part
that
makes two.
the work of Daniel Kahneman demonstrating 96% of the time we're just running on automatic. And that comes back, I think, to Klaus's comment that our choices, we don't make a list of choices and then select from them most of the time. We just behave in a certain way that has become habitual. That's why I think creating good habits is such an important part of us making good choices. Because most of the time, we just make decisions, based on some implicit choices inside of us. We're not going through a list and saying, I'm going to rank this as 90%, no, I'll select that one. It's only a small percentage of the time we actually do that. So we want to behave in this ethical, other-oriented, caring way. We need to create habits that allow us to do that, because most of the time, otherwise, we simply won't. And we will think that we have the right, because this system, one side, consolidated thinking, hasn't given any capacity to adapt itself. So it always thinks it's right until it shifts into this slow thinking and questions its assumptions.
I think it's not only habits, because if it was only habits, you'd never have expertise building.
Yeah.
So there is engagement in the flow of engagement that changes, fundamentally changes the structure of your thinking. That's why I had the layers of the language cognition and the systemic cognition. As you act, both are changed so that the apparent habit or the fast action is not just habit. It can be a habit or it can be appropriate to the situation, which is really nice in an emergency.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Stu and then.
Yeah, I'd like to make concrete several of these observations. That I was impressed earlier in the conference when we were talking about resilience and rebuilding various parts of a community that are destroyed. And several times people say that the wealthy parts are restored and the poor parts are moved. And I think very often within the recent decades, we've become aware of the relational systems in poor communities. And the people who rebuild the cities aren't that much aware of what is going on. And so we have a tendency to inflict additional destruction on the poor parts of the community that aren't so well represented. And that if we can increase awareness of what are the role of the seeds of the ivy or the poor parts of town, then we'll be able to make more ethical decisions about what is restored and what is removed. And very often when we talk about urban development, we want to put in a new Olympic stadium. Well, you put it in the poor part of town because obviously that's the less valuable real estate. Or if you want to attract a World's Fair, you wipe out one part of town because you want to redevelop it without thinking that much about the relationships that are being destroyed along the way.
Mm-hmm. Robert Moses.
Probably, yes. A good example.
We're coming back to diversity of relationships here again, too.
Yeah, and who makes the decisions? Is everyone included in the decision?
Yes.
Just coming back to what Klaus said, I agree with you in that it's through our actions that we can take a measurement. For me, the difference in reflecting, being personal, and reflecting, being in community. Because if I measure my ethics, I can think about what's my behaviors in line with my thinking, but only when I see it through the eyes of the other, in terms of what I've done and how they see my behavior, can I then measure if it was ethics. So I agree with you when you say it's through the action.
Can I respond to that? How do you know how do you can see through the eyes of the other? You imagine it.
Yeah.
Let me give you the communication mechanism through which that comes about. And that is actually holding someone accountable. There is, for example, C. Wright Mills, famous sociologist, who wanted to study what happens in board meetings and how is power exerted. And he found out that it is the question of holding someone accountable. If you ask, why did you say that? At that moment, you're forced to think, maybe I had alternatives. Before that, you didn't even know that. And the act of asking someone to hold accountable creates actually the alternatives that you now have to talk about. And at that moment also you can see, if you want, the metaphor of seeing yourself through the eyes of the other by hearing what the other people have to object and what they support, if you want, and how justifications go. I mean, these are communicational strategies that make you aware of, for example, alternatives. And you mentioned earlier, we don't know what we're talking until we have talked about. And that's very true. You know? And that comes, again, particularly in relationships. I think we create a relationship by asking someone, oh, why do you explain? Why do you do this? And that creates both the relationship and the awareness of the alternatives that you had and you didn't think of. I mean, sometimes you can think of it. I know, for example, planners, they write down all the alternatives, no doubt. But most of the plans are actually, the alternatives come from objections from this party, that party, and then you sort them out and then you see the alternatives. But largely from the accounts that you harvest through your proposals.
Should stop the video.
I'm not sure I
Looking
can.
very puzzled.
No, there's a question behind it, but I was thinking about what you're saying. I was thinking, obviously, it's through the feedback or the responses that you're getting, because can you have unethical thinking?
Well, not just responses. There's a difference from saying, yeah, but there's another one is saying, can you explain what do you mean? What is the purpose of your saying? Or it's wrong because of these kind of consequences. And then you start realizing, embedding what you did, become aware of what you did in terms of the consequences that other people see.
Yeah.
I've just been warned that we should end, so we'll take 3 more questions and then carry on.
This-
Oh, you want it then? No.
No, I'm just getting up.
Yeah.
This is more of a comment. If I were to point out and say, well, this was all very fuzzy and ambiguous,
Yes.
people would look at me and as if I had committed a crime, because it's like, how dare I say this? But what I really got out of your talk was the fact that you were really pointing out at every other moment that what we're doing is inherently fuzzy and ambiguous. And I think for me this is really valuable, because as I've always thought about science, science is about achieving clarity. But in fact, what has to happen, for example, when you talked about interdimensionality, dimensionality, the dimensionality is within us. The system is with us. And the system is our way of simplifying what that is to something that we can understand. And as soon as it's clarified, then we know and we've beaten the ambiguity out of it, we know that we've actually simplified it beyond what is maybe helpful in helping to preserve its resilience.
If you think about that.
So it's very beautiful.
That long statement from the Resilience Alliance, where I was able to color every other word as ambiguous, yet out of that flow of ambiguous words, people get a sense to which they can respond. So that even though we're dancing in ambiguity inherently, we do dance together.
And we should never forget that. Yeah. That this is inherent and fundamental.
Somebody in the back had a hand up. Who was it? Yeah.
Following up on several comments, there's a kind of a positive tilt and a kind of a negative tilt in this domain of choices. And I was remembering there's a political philosopher, theoretician, Walter Dean Burnham, had a phrase called the politics of excluded alternatives. And so there are forces, that we might be looking for or assembling that are looking for the channels or ways that we can find this increase in choices and alternatives. But there are other processes at work that actually are consciously themselves, or maybe, I would say consciously looking to limit choices and limit choices in the public domain, possibly processes like Klaus was mentioning, our ways of resurrecting or finding them, but the politics of, let's say, the ethical imperative of approaching the search for choice, the opening of choices, is sort of the opposite side of the search, of the process of consciously limiting.
And then the excluding alternatives is not necessarily always uncaring, because there's also enabling constraints that enable the activities you want, which are, constraints are essentially a form of exclusion or focus. So again, it gets like quicksand. Somebody else, or are we having a break?
I think it's time for a break. Can we thank Pille?